Warm greetings from the Center for National Security Studies and welcome to Authors Insights. I'm your host, Balasubramanian, Head of India Strategic Studies Program at the Center for National Security Studies. Today, we are in a conversation with Mr. Bertil Lintner, an acclaimed journalist who has been writing about Asia for more than 4 decades and is an expert on contemporary Southeast Asia. He has authored 17 books on Asian politics and history. Today, we will discuss his latest book, The End of the Chinese Century: How Xi Jinping Lost the Belt and Road Initiative, published in October 2024 by HarperCollins. Welcome, Mr. Lintner, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Quickly moving on to the first question. From 2014, when China surpassed the US in terms of purchasing power parity, many dubbed it the coming of the Chinese century, to now, where you describe in your book the empty monuments of Beijing's insatiable desire for growth. Could you explain where China has fundamentally gone wrong? Were its aspirations for global leadership always destined to fail, or could it have done something differently over the past decade?
Well, we have to remember that it was October 2013 that Xi Jinping launched what was called the One Belt, One Road initiative in the beginning, and they became then the Belt and Road Initiative. And they claimed it's going to be bigger than the Marshall Plan, which the United States launched after World War II to rebuild, war-devastated country to Western Europe. China was going to spend trillions of dollars on infrastructure projects across the globe and so on. And because of it, become the world's leading superpower. But a decade later, it's clear that it doesn't really turn out that way. And something completely different has, the outcome has been completely different. First of all, China can hardly afford it. And more importantly, really, there is no plan. There's never been any plan for the Belt and Road Initiative. There's never been any central governmental agency that's been in charge of it, or any division of responsibilities and duties and so on. And there was more like a Chinese Communist Party style mass movement, something like the Great Leap Forward in the late 1950s, which turned out to be a total disaster. Why not the Cultural Revolution? And because of these shortcomings of the whole thing, nobody really knows what it was all about. I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative, as it is been described, it was described in the beginning, included everything from the construction of bridges and railways and ports to amusement parks and even Belt and Road coloring books for children. And I think it was clear from the beginning that it was going to fail. It's not going to turn out to be what Xi Jinping had envisaged. And unlike the Marshall Plan, which was mostly actually aid, and a very small portion was in grants, the Belt and Road Initiative is almost exclusively loans. And maybe that is how Xi Jinping had thought it would be economically, financially viable. The people have to pay back the money which they've been given to all these countries for all these various projects. But many of these countries turn out to be, not rich enough to pay back these loans. And then China would demand equity instead of repayments. But what is China going to do with the electricity generating authority of Laos, for instance? So once the money is gone, it's not coming back. And I think Xi Jinping is realizing this, 10 years down the road. And that is why what we are seeing today is a much reduced version of the original idea, because it was never a plan. I mean, Xi Jinping still wants China to become the world's leading superpower. There's no doubt about that. But the initial plan, I think, has been, or whatever you want to call it, has been scrapped. And what we're seeing today is a much reduced version of the initial Belt and Road Initiative.
In your book, you also provide a lot of a detailed analysis of how China's relations with its neighbors have evolved over the years, which also sheds a lot of light on the historical context that shapes, those ties today. But at the same time, you also challenge some of the exaggerated narratives about Chinese influence in earlier centuries, This is in particular, through the Silk Road. Given the roadblock China has faced in the past decade, do you suggest that it might downscale its global ambitions and focus more on its immediate region? Do you think China's future success will depend primarily on its regional relationship, especially in light of the incoming US administration under President Trump? What are your views, sir?
Yes, absolutely. Because we also have to understand and realize that the Belt and Road Initiative, the whole idea, is built on a myth. And that's a myth about the Silk Road. I mean, the Silk Road, the first time that term was used by anyone was in the 1870s by a German geographer called Ferdinand von Richthofen. And he used it in German that time, Seidenstraßen, so in the plural. And what he discovered then was trade routes through Central Asia. And he found this very catchy phrase, that kind of at that time appealed to the Western mind about this exotic East, silk and so on, and camels trudging through the desert and stuff like that. But I mean, it was still only used in academic circles. It was not until 1936 that one of Ferdinand von Richthofen's students from the university in Berlin, a Swedish explorer called Sven Hedin, wrote a book which was called The Silk Road. It was the first time that term ever appeared anywhere. But it caught on. Became very popular. And since then, everyone has been talking about the Silk Road. I mean, nobody is doubting that there was trade between various cities and power centers in Central Asia. And it's also possible that some goods came from China through different middlemen until they ended up in Central Asia. But there was never any huge trade in silk all the way from China to Europe. I mean, this is a total myth. The most important trading item at that time was actually spices. It would have been more correct to talk about the spice road from India, because there were spices from India that went to Central Asia, to Istanbul, and then to the rest of Europe. That trade was massive. There was never any Silk Road. And in China, they never used the term Silk Road until the 1980s, when they realized that this is something that can be, big hit globally. We talk about the Silk Roads, sounds exotic and all this. It will show that China has always been a big trading nation, which it hasn't. I mean, it's a fairly new phenomenon. And now they're sort of inventing new Silk Roads crisscrossing the globe. You have the Southern Silk Road, you have the Maritime Silk Road, even an Arctic Silk Road. And all this is part, of course, Chinese propaganda without any kind of validity or any roots in actual history. But what we're seeing here now is vastly reduced BRI. And they still talk about the Silk Road, but they can do that if they want to. But I believe that instead of concentrating on the whole globe, because it's not going to work, China has settled, or Xi Jinping rather, and his government have settled for certain areas in the immediate neighborhood where China's influence can become very important and even dominant. And one is, of course, the Russian Far East with all its mineral resources. It's Southeast Asia, huge markets and also an access to trading routes through the Indian Ocean. Then you have the Himalayas in South Asia, very important. And then, of course, the Indian and Pacific Oceans. And the Pacific Ocean is the buffer between China and the United States. So it's also of utmost strategic importance. I think that's what we're going to see today. But that is not going to be easy either. If we look at a typical example would be the Russian Far East. Everyone is talking about this new alliance between China and Russia. But let's face it, China and Russia have not always been friends. Just have to go back to the 60s and the division within the communist camp in those days. And even earlier than that, most of the Russian Far East was once Chinese territory. And the Chinese haven't really forgotten that. If you look at Chinese maps, cities like Vladivostok, Khabarovsk, Blagoveshchensk, on Chinese maps, they have Chinese names, which are entirely different. And we can see that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a severe economic crisis in Russia, because during World War II, the then Soviet Union, they moved, for all these reasons, defense, the war, they moved the heavy industry from European Soviet Union to the Far East. to be easy to defend it there. But then when the Soviet Union collapsed, the economy collapsed as well. So the heavy industry in the Russian Far East was dismantled and sold as scrap metal to China. And Putin, the new strongman of Russia, he obviously wants Chinese help to rebuild his industrial base in the Russian Far East. But China is not interested in building factories there. Why should they? The Chinese are interested in building roads and ports so they can get the minerals out of the Russian Far East. Oil, gas, timber, whatever they can find there. Yeah, I think that is bound to also cause friction between two very close allies such as Russia and China. But and then we take this South Pacific. I mean, China is moving in a big way there to buy up these small, very vulnerable island nations. I actually heard today on the news that the Cook Islands, a tiny territory with only about 20,000 people living there, but it's self-governing, but it's in a kind of free association with New Zealand, as I say it. And New Zealand is very upset about agreements that the Cook Islands have signed with China. I mean, China is, of course, not interested in those tiny islands. But if you look at the economic exclusive zones around those island territories, they are huge. They're in the millions, hundreds of thousands, or sometimes even millions of square kilometers. That is what China wants to control. And that is, again, going to cause problems with many countries in the immediate neighborhood. And then not to mention the Himalayas and South Asia, the Indian Ocean, we see a very similar development. So we're going to see a much reduced Belt and Road Initiative, but it's also a lot of conflicts there, or potential conflicts there, which could easily become sharper as things develop.
You have busted a lot of myths about the Chinese Silk Road. And speaking of Xi Jinping specifically, today Xi Jinping's conviction is that it is no longer necessary to hide China's strength and bide its time. This belief has also translated into China's global initiatives such as the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and the recent of Global Civilization Initiative. But despite the challenges, the One Belt and One Road, the BRI has faced in various parts of the world, Xi Jinping today speaks of building a community of shared future for the mankind. How do you explain this phenomenon, sir?
Well, I think Xi Jinping sees himself as the third big hero of modern China, so to speak. The first was talking about post-revolutionary China. The first was, of course, Mao Zedong. He defeated the old system. He uprooted feudalism. He unified China in a way that China had not been unified for many centuries. And then came Deng Xiaoping, who modernized China. He opened up the country to the outside world. He got the economy going and made China into an economic superpower. I mean, he was called a capitalist roader by his detractors during the Cultural Revolution. And that turned out to be true. He was a capitalist roader. And that actually uplifted China from being a very underdeveloped third world country to an industrial superpower. And then it's Xi Jinping, who wants to go a step further. He wants to make China the global superpower. He wanted to make it more important and stronger than the United States. And that is his ambition, and therefore he's launched all these global initiatives. But if you look at the world today, well, this century is not going to be a Chinese century, but the American century, that's already passed into history anyway. What we're seeing in today's world, it's a very multipolar kind of situation. We have many different kind of power centers and groups. BRICS is one example of that, for instance. I don't think there can be any single, leading superpower in the world anymore. And Xi Jinping has to realize that and come down to be a little bit more realistic in his ambitions. That's what I believe anyway.
Speaking of ideology, how do you interpret Xi Jinping's vision of this community of a common destiny for mankind as he has enunciated in his ideological framework, especially in the context of the BRI? Because given China's growing regional influence in parts like Central and Southeast Asia, how do you see this vision challenging the existing Western-led global order? Furthermore, with all the principal contradiction that has been happening between the Chinese values and the universal value, how do you anticipate an ideological competition shaping China's future relations with the West, and what role do you think it will play in the broader geopolitical landscape?
Yeah, there's no doubt that China is one of the world's most powerful nations today. There's no question about that. And as I said, I mean, I think the American century, that's history. Europe is becoming a retirement home. It's not much economic progress happening there at all. And it's one crisis after another. So the focus of economic activity and economic change and development, I think, is shifting. I think it's shifting from the West to primarily Asia. But then in Asia, we have many different players. China is not alone. Japan, one not to forget, even though it's perhaps not as economically powerful as it was a couple of decades ago. You have India, the rise of India, which is very important. Probably the only regional superpower that can seriously challenge China. But I don't think India wants to replace China. It's more that we want to have a more balanced situation in the region, where not one single power will control everything. And that's why we're seeing this kind of multipolar world emerging. And China will be an important player there, but it doesn't have to be the most dominant player. I don't think it will be. There's so much opposition here in Southeast Asia, where I live, for instance. Nobody really dares to challenge China openly, but they do it anyway in many different ways. They're not agreeing to everything that China wants from this part of the world. So there is a lot of resentment there here as well. Nobody wants to be dominated by another superpower. It's enough that America was a dominant superpower for many years. They don't want another superpower to replace America. When China, for instance, is the country that's always been very proud of its independence. And they're not going to just kowtow for those leaders in Beijing, even if it is a much smaller, less powerful country than China. Then we have Vietnam. Look, historically, Vietnam and China have always been enemies. And although the government in Vietnam is trying to, it's best to have good relations with China, there's a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment in Vietnam. And then you have very similar kind of tendencies across Southeast Asia. So what we're going to see is a more level kind of playing field here, where there's not one superpower that controls everything. That's history, that's gone.
If I can delve a bit further, a lot of today Western scholars who have written during the Cold War times, regarding USSR, disintegration of USSR, imploding from within, a few writings when we come across, they say about will China also face the USSR moment, imploding from within, disintegration, etc. What are your thoughts on this, sir?
Well, China and Russia, of course, on superficially, so to speak, they are very close allies today. But we also see how Russia is, whether we like it or not, it's not relevant. How Russia under Putin is actually reasserting itself on the global stage in a way that it lost completely under Boris Yeltsin and even under Gorbachev. So, but there is in terms of the cause conflicts with China, and we can already see that in a country that I have written a lot about, for more than 40 years, and that is Myanmar, where the junta in Myanmar doesn't want to be dependent on China. When they opened up the country to the outside world in 2011, it was not because they suddenly become Democrats. It was because the Chinese dominance had become so overwhelming that they were afraid of losing their independence and their sovereignty. And therefore, they wanted to improve relations with the West. But in order for that to succeed, they had to make certain concessions. For instance, allow political parties to be active, release political prisoners, allow a free press, and so on. And this is not just me guessing here. I've seen internal classified documents from the Myanmar army stating precisely this. And but the first they did was not just to turn to the West. The junta or the military government in Myanmar turned to Russia. And Russia is a very close ally of the government, also of the government that seized power after the coup 4 years ago in February 2021. And China is not really pleased about that. You have seen, you can say things on social media, but the Chinese are very upset about, about this competition they're getting from Russia. And Myanmar is actually emerging as Russia's foremost ally in Southeast Asia. And that is in the country with China, it is utmost strategic importance to China because Myanmar is China's outlet to the Indian Ocean. And that is what they call the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. And concept has been there for several decades, but China doesn't want to have any competitors. So we're going to see a lot of conflicts of that nature emerge. And Xi Jinping may dream of being, in this global community where everybody is happy and cooperating with each other. But it's a fantasy. It's not going to happen. And we can see it's not happening.
Regarding BRI and other challenges, let me discuss this as a potential concluding question, sir. Given the mounting domestic challenges that China faces today, such as shrinking labor force and aging population and severe environmental issues and stress, do you believe China can continue to pursue its ambitious global initiative like the Belt and Road Initiative without risking internal instability? How do you see the balance between addressing the domestic pressures and maintaining political legitimacy while striving for a very larger role in the international stage?
Well, that's a very interesting question because China today is not what China was 20 years ago. Salaries are not, it's not a low-cost country at all. It's expensive to invest in China. Salaries are comparable to many sort of much more developed countries in the world. And then you go to, of course, the totalitarian or the authoritarian system, political system in China. It's very difficult to predict the future, and I think anything can happen. Sometimes even unexpected things do happen. But I think it would be fair to say that as long as the Chinese economy, China is doing relatively well economically, people will put up with the authoritarian political system that exists. Let's say there's a severe economic crisis. The economy take a more serious downturn than what we've seen over the past few years, then I think we can expect political unrest as well. But political unrest in a huge country like China could go terribly wrong. It is not a small country where internal conflicts can be settled easily. So I think it all depends on how much economic stability the Chinese government can manage to maintain. But once that start to be serious problems there, then we're going to see serious political problems, internal political problems in China as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lintner, for sharing your valuable insights with us today. Your expertise on Asia and the Belt and Road Initiative has provided a clearer understanding of the challenges shaping the region. We really appreciate you taking the time to discuss your book, The End of the Chinese Century, How Xi Jinping Lost the Belt and Road Initiative with us. To our viewers, thank you for tuning in. Be sure to pick up Mr. Lintner's book for a comprehensive exploration of these critical issues. Until next time, goodbye. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir, for taking time to be with us. And I hope to continue and further this